Welcome to Primary Markets TV, your insight into newly issued securities within the fixed income and equity space. I'm Ruth Emery. Joining me today is Daniele D'Alvia, CEO of SPAC Consultancy. We're going to be talking about key trends with SPACs and also how risky they are. Daniele, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So last week you organised the first conference about SPACs in Europe. What were the main takeaways?
The three main objectives we point out were that SPACs are new alternative acquisition models. They do not have to compete to traditional IPO because issuers have the possibility to have a SPAC, a traditional IPO, and then direct listings. So it's just another form to raise capital. Mm-hmm. And then we also analyze the possibility that actually regulation is key. And so there is this dilemma between self-regulation and regulation.
And how do you see the SPAC market developing in the US?
I think that in the US we had a very exponential growth of SPACs. So from 2020 and then 2021 until we saw some concern from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Even the warning of the warrants was creating disruption in the market. And in fact, the number of listings started to decrease. The only fact that I would say is that the market would have reached a sort of equilibrium by itself. So or SEC or not SEC oriented in any case was not sustainable, that kind of listing process of the SPAC in terms of numbers of listings. However, I do believe that America has a very great financial regulation for SPACs, so I do predict that SPACs, they are there to stay.
Okay. And what about over in Europe? What are the key trends there?
In Europe, it's a little bit different. And in fact, the head of listing of Euronext in the conference has highlighted how some regulators in Europe are more flexible. Other regulators are less flexible. So it's something that really has to deal with harmonization in Europe. Because in Europe, we like to have harmonization of the law. And although we do not need a real secondary legislative act like a directive or a regulation that would like to harmonize the SPAC phenomenon in Europe, the head of listing of Euronext was suggesting that regulators, they should be more free to regulate SPACs as they prefer. It's better sometimes not to regulate because a lot of innovation is on the sponsor side.
And what do you say to critics of SPACs who view them as expensive, opaque, risky, and the fact that regulators are looking at them very closely?
We, of course, raised the point that SPACs can destroy value, actually. Mm-hmm. Many times after the de-SPAC process, the value of shares tend to decrease. So there is a destruction of value. Mm-hmm. It's also true that SPACs are already heavily regulated, at least in the US. So the point of concern are not really there in the sense that in the end are independent decisions of investors if they believe in the SPAC management. That is the big issue, actually.
And what about SPAC returns, as history shows that they do underperform traditional IPOs? So why should investors invest?
I personally proposed a view because there was a recent study that showed that actually if the manager has a track record and so they sponsor other SPACs and they completed a business combination in a successful way, the value of those shares tend to increase. So they make good deals.
You recently wrote a piece on SPACs and Bitcoin saying that they both disrupt the common wisdom of investing. Can you explain a bit further?
SPACs and Bitcoin have a lot in common in the sense that Bitcoins, for example, are a sort of currency, and currency is based on faith. In the same way, we have to trust the management of the SPAC, so the sponsor. They are both financial innovations. So actually, we invest in innovation and we do not know if we need to over-regulate them or to be more permissive in regulating those instruments. And another key feature why they are similar is the possibility they open to retail investors. So for example, especially in the case of SPACs, if we have seen usually in the development stage of a company, before going to traditional IPO, you started to have some round of financing through venture capital.
Mm-hmm.
Now, actually, SPACs, they replace this system. So you have a SPAC that is already on the market, is going to acquire a private company, and that private company can in some way enjoy the same benefit of a venture capital at late stage. And usually, as we know, late stage venture capital financing was only reserved for institutional investors. Well, now also retail investors in SPACs, they can bet on the future performance of a target company. And the same thing is with Bitcoin. You try to bet on the future creation of value.
So in terms of comparing SPACs to cryptocurrency, is there anything you think needs to happen to make it, I guess, a more stable market and to sort of win over more investors in future?
I think one key point is the self-regulation. Because they are like sort of financial innovations, financial operators, they tend to have more knowledge about it. So the best way for regulators, I think, is not to go really in a sort of fight, but like to cooperate and to create a sort of hybrid model of regulation of those financial innovations.
That's been brilliant. Thanks so much for your time, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.